And to kick us off this afternoon, we're delighted to welcome to the conference both Andrew Scheps and Gary Bromham. So a bit of information about Andrew to start with. So Andrew Scheps has engineered and mixed some of the biggest rock bands in the world, including Green Day, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Weezer, Audioslave, Black Sabbath, Metallica, Linkin Park, Hozier, and U2. He's worked with legends such as Johnny Cash, Neil Diamond, and Iggy Pop, as well as country artists such as the Zac Brown Band. In addition, he continues to work with indie artists such as My Brightest Diamond, Rancid, CRX, and Blood Red Shoes. Andrew has been awarded 3 Grammys for his work with Adele, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Ziggy Marley, and his work has garnered over 20 nominations in categories such as Best Rock Song, Best Rock Album, and Best Hard Rock Performance. In addition, Andrew was named International Engineer of the Year Award by UK's Music Producers Guild. Though starting out as a musician, Andrew found that what he enjoyed the most was actually working behind the scenes. He toured with Stevie Wonder as a keyboard tech and Michael Jackson as mixing live sound, but he soon found his home in the studio and honed his craft working for producers such as Rob Cavallo and Rick Rubin. In addition to recording and mixing, he's also taken on the role of producer with bands such as Favez, The Duke Spirit, and Marty Pello. Andrew also started Tonequake Records, which is a boutique indie label with acts including Low Raw, as well as Favez, Act Rights, Heidi Happy, 2200, and others. After 25 years in Los Angeles, Andrew relocated to the UK in July 2015, where he set up his own mix room. We're delighted. I mean, such an amazing biography and so inspiring to have you here today, Andrew. And Andrew is in discussion with LCM's very own Gary Bromham, who we're delighted has joined us today to conduct the session. Gary's a very valued hourly paid lecturer within LCM, is also a musician and a researcher himself. I'm going to hand over to these guys. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And I'm going to turn my screen off and leave you guys to it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz. Hello.
Thanks so much, Liz. And hey, Andrew, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, good. It's crazy times, but we're still smiling. So
yes.
Yeah, I mean, where do we start? The list of credits, you know.
That was pretty embarrassing just then.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking through last night at. I mean, we've spoken a few times before, but I was looking through at some of those artists you work with, and just in awe of some of those. And actually, I'm going to start with a fairly abstract question. I'm going to ask you about that picture of you in front of the tractor. I have to.
I was mowing. I was mowing a field. My wife's father was a farmer, and we live in the area where she grew up. And so, yeah, that particular picture, I was taking care of a field that needed topping.
Excellent. So,
yeah,
I wondered if there was some kind of agricultural, fantastic agricultural.
No, I would definitely not say that I'm a farmer, but I do enjoy driving a tractor. It's a good day when you're driving a tractor.
Fantastic. Superb. Yeah, so I guess we'll start at the beginning. I wanted to know a little bit about your background. I'm thinking particularly of Planet Recording in New York, where I understand you were an intern, and also about some of the background as a programmer with New England Digital with the Synclavier, which of course I'm, as a Fairlight programmer, I was very interested in speaking to you about. Maybe you could say something a little bit about the way that you started.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of discovered that making records was a thing while I was still in like junior high or high school, and decided that's what I wanted to do. My parents were adamant that I go to school and get a degree, which I think was a very good call, especially at the time. So I went to the University of Miami and studied recording, but it was a major in music and a minor in electrical engineering, and then lots of electives. So Planet was actually a studio that I interned at in a summer while I was still in college. I just took resumes to basically every studio in New York, which at that point, I think I took over 100 resumes around. And a few weeks later, I got a call from this studio Planet, which was in the basement of a building 1 block south of Penn Station in Manhattan, saying, hey, do you want to come work nights and answer the phones? Like, yep, absolutely. So I did that for a summer, which was great. Really great. I got to sit in on a bunch of sessions. They also had rehearsal rooms, and the Ramones came in one time while I'm answering phones and had to like get them food, and so that was great. And then the Synclavier thing was, I finished at Miami and I thought I would go get a job in a studio, because back then the normal thing you would do is become a runner at a studio and then work your way up to assistant and then, come up the ranks. But a friend of mine was working at New England Digital, who made the Synclavier, and said there's an opening for a field service tech in Los Angeles. And I thought, well, that actually involves getting paid. So that's what I did. I just took the job because I've always been a bit of a geek. I'm like to be technical and I like to know how stuff works. So I fixed Synclaviers for 3 years. I did it for a year and a half in LA and a year and a half in London. Then realized I wasn't making records, and that's when I quit that job and then went freelance and did some of the touring, and then realized I still wasn't making records and made the decision to just stay home and try and make records.
Sure. And I mean, my own context is of using the Fairlight, but it's always interesting to me how we kind of not only are we kind of nostalgic about analog technology, but there's a huge amount of sort of I guess retro aesthetics has become quite a big retro digital aesthetics have become quite a big deal for us, and a lot of people talk about early digital technology. I mean, do you have fond memories of the Synclavier, or do you just remember it as a nightmare? I remember the software from using it on a couple of sessions.
Well, I mean, when you talk about the higher level digital stuff like the Synclavier and the Fairlight, the Synclavier was recording at 100K back in the early 90s. And so it was in a lot of ways way more advanced. The sequencer was sample accurate. If you were sequencing drums and you wanted the kick drum louder, you would duplicate the sequencer track because the samples were going to trigger completely in phase and it would be 6 dB louder. So there are things about it that we're still not at in kind of the mainstream technology. Obviously, the flexibility and the software manipulation of things is a million times further than what was going on then. But in a lot of ways, that was some really, really advanced technology. I mean, the way the waveframe could pitch samples is still completely unmatched. There's no sampler that pitches things around as seamlessly as the waveframe did back then. So yeah, the nostalgia thing though, that is, yeah, whatever. There's a lot of nostalgia, especially for the analog stuff. I have lots of theories about that, but I think really sonically what it is it's nostalgia for getting all kinds of stuff for free. You go through any analog box and you get compression, you get distortion, you get filtering without even wanting to. You think you're just EQing, but you're doing all of those things as well. And tape especially distorted the sound like crazy, and when you were good at using tape in a good way. So I think in a way people are nostalgic for things to be free, in terms of stuff sounds better just because you're going through a box, if you think that that stuff makes it sound better. But also, I think things were simpler. It was much simpler to work in a studio where you had a set number of hardware tools and you had to make a decision about, what am I going to use that compressor on? Not for every single thing, which of the 1,000 compressors should I use on this at a time? So I think with the choices being limited, it forced you to be a little bit more creative without having to think about it.
It's interesting actually that you've brought up this point about options versus creativity. I mean, we talk a lot about that in music technology now, don't we? Where we have sort of unlimited options and we kind of sit there pulling our hair out thinking, so I have 800 plugins here, I probably only use 8 of them. And do you think there's an argument for self-imposed limitations when you're producing and when you're records and when you're making music?
Yeah, I mean, if you're unable to discipline yourself just in general, then I think it's really good to make rules. I mean, I don't remember which record it was, but there's a Radiohead record where they said we've got 24 tracks per song, period. And of course, they could have had unlimited tracks. They could have done whatever they wanted. They could have 12 Pro Tools rigs all running with satellite in sync. But they decided for this record, they wanted to think about the productions and the arrangements and the recordings for 24 tracks. And so putting limitations on yourself, all it does is it forces you to make decisions. And that's what's sort of, I think, lost with how flexible everything is, because making decisions throughout the production process is really, really important. Otherwise, you're not moving forward. You're just constantly moving laterally, kind of filling in a chart of what you think you need to do. And then you, at the very end, somehow you're going to sort everything out and make all your decisions at once. And that's not really a productive way to work. So if you need to make a list of things you're going to do, then that's a great way to do it. But I think in general, you need to be disciplined to limit your options all the time.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. And I think it's something that it occurs to many of us, particularly those of us that started in maybe a period where there were far less options, and maybe you had 2 or 3 reverbs and you had 1 delay, and maybe you had, I said I wouldn't talk about too much about compressors, but maybe you had only 2 or 3 compressors. And so you learn to work within those limitations.
Well, you never thought, oh, well, I can't make this record now because we don't have enough stuff. It never even occurred to you. You would always make the record with whatever was in the room. Like that just was it. And I think now the only time that people run into that is microphone choices. Like there are a set number of microphones and you're in a room. But once you're past that, it's just limitless. And I think that's great. I mean, it's amazing to have all those options, but it is also, it can paralyze you. So I think, and I know this morning, apparently people were talking about the idea of making mistakes, and there's no right way to do it. Therefore, you can't ever be wrong. So there's no such thing as a mistake. A mistake is like deleting files off of a hard drive. That's a mistake. We can qualify that and say, okay, objectively, that's a mistake. But everything else is just a choice. And so the more committed you are to your choices, and the more your choices are based on what it is you're actually hearing and what your vision is, and not just, well, I think I'm supposed to do this. When it's really based on a creative flow through a project, it's impossible to make a mistake. There's no such thing.
Sure. And I guess some people would view, in that sense, failure as an opportunity. There's no such thing as a failure.
No. I mean, you can fail in someone else's eyes. You can get fired. People can hate what you do. Like that is all failure, but it's only failure in the context of what someone else thinks. And the great thing is there's no right answer, so therefore there's no wrong answer. The horrible thing is there's no right answer. You can't ever be on your own working on a mix and say, this is amazing, because no matter how great you think it is, the person whose decision it is might hate it. And it's perfectly valid for them to hate it. Yeah. So yeah, it definitely goes both ways.
Sure. So I'm conscious of time, so I want to go back a little, sort of post your university and synclavier days, and talk about maybe some of those early records that you made. And I guess a name I have to bring up here is Rick Rubin, because I know that you've made a lot of records with Rick Rubin, which absolutely fascinates me. And certainly when I've talked to people about Rick Rubin, they've said, well, there are various types of producers. That some are very technical, some just make great coffee and tea, and then there's the fan. And they talk about this person who is a fan of the music and just wants to make a great record because they're just so into this band. And this seems to come through in your work. And I'm wondering if any of that came from the work you have done with Rick Rubin in the past. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could definitely describe him as a super fan. And the thing is, he is always just listening to the end product. He would never say, well, we've spent 4 days trying to make this better and it's not getting better, so I guess it's okay. Like, that's not a concept that makes any sense. If it's not as good as it's supposed to be, whatever that is, then it's not done. Now, it helps to have unlimited budgets and he can call anyone in the world to come play on it. And obviously, it's a different universe of making records, but the attitude is really important. And that is the way he assesses whether a record is done or not, is whether it's exactly what he was hoping it would be. And I suppose, I think you like to think that you feel that way too. And of course, that's the only way you'll do things. But to be in situations where you can actually work that way really helps you understand when you sort of stray from that path. I mean, if you spend 6 hours on an overdub, getting the sound just right and really working on the sound and the performance and everything, it's going to be very hard for you to come in the next day, hear it and say, wow, that's actually not helping, and just scrap it. But that's exactly what you need to do. You have to just assess it completely out of the box of knowing what it took to do it. And because you hear story after story after story of people say, oh my God, but that one song on that album was absolute magic. It's like, oh, right. Yeah, that was like one take and we didn't even know it was rolling and the song wasn't finished. And that's the magic. So the effort doesn't always correlate to the quality. And he's the epitome of never even considering that one might have anything to do with the other.
Sure, and I guess this connects with something that I've heard you say many times, which is the only thing that matters is what comes out of the speakers. And I guess we obsess. I've been there. I've spent 8 hours programming hi-hat patterns for people, for them only to say no, that's not quite right. And for me, I think we often obsess about those things that are largely quite unimportant, but we seem to focus our energy on these tiny little things. We forget maybe the lead vocal is just too, it's too bright, or maybe it just isn't loud enough or something like that. And it takes almost like a punter to come along and say, I can't hear the words. And you're thinking, yeah, that's very profound. I didn't even think. I was sitting there mixing this for 10 hours and I didn't even think about that. So I don't know if that kind of connects with this idea that you're talking about with Rick Rubin in some way.
Well, I mean, not even necessarily with Rick. I mean, I think for anybody working on anything, it's trying to constantly reset your perspective. You have to hear it as a listener will hear it to know what it is. Because if you know the details of it and you think the snare sounds great, then you're listening to the snare, and nobody cares about the snare drum when they're just hearing the song for the first time. So it's the task is to reset and hear it the way somebody who knows nothing about making records will hear it. Because obviously that's the end goal. If you're only going to have the people who worked on the record listen to it, well, you're not going to make much money selling records that way. So the goal is to have everybody in the world who doesn't know anything about records want to listen to your record. And that's the way you have to be listening. Sometimes it's the hi-hat pattern that makes it compelling. I mean, who knows? It's impossible to say what is compelling and what isn't, but you have to always be listening in that way just to say, what's the emotional impact I get from listening to this? Not how does it sound? Is it loud enough? Is it the right tempo? The only reason it wouldn't be the right tempo is if it's dragging and you're getting bored, not because that tempo is not correct on paper for something. Like, there's no intellectual argument that you should ever be able to make that trumps how you feel when you hear it. And I'm sorry for using that word. Trying to avoid it.
We had to.
Yeah.
At some point. So actually, I want to talk a little bit about, you've done so much work with the Chili Peppers, and people would literally lynch me if I didn't at least go there and talk to you a little bit about your work with. And actually, last night when I was going through some of their work, I was listening to Stadium Arcadium, so the Danny California album. I wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing a little with us about maybe that album. Was that the first album you did with them?
No, I worked on the album before, doing a lot of overdubs with John Frusciante and things like that. Okay. But that was, I was involved in that record a lot. I didn't do any of the basic tracking, but I recorded all the vocals with Anthony, and then I mixed half of it and did lots of overdubs and things like that. So that record was, they went back to the house that they had done Blood Sugar Sex Magik in. So it was a bit of a, I don't know if that was an experiment in trying to recapture anything, or they just decided to do it, or, it was just something to do. But also talking about putting restrictions on yourself, they decided that record was going to be recorded to tape. So that record was all done on 24-track tape. Obviously not all one reel. They didn't limit themselves to the tracks. I mean, John would fill up an entire slave reel of tape with guitar overdubs or background vocals or whatever. So the songs got big. And when mixing, I had 2 tape machines locked up. And then I was actually dragging Pro Tools behind it for some percussion overdubs we'd done at the last minute and things like that, where we didn't have any tracks left. So it didn't limit us technically, but it did force them to go for performance. I mean, some of the songs are obviously edits between takes, but it wasn't, let's go fix this, let's go fix that, fly that from there. It was very much, we love the verses on this take, let's get the second chorus from that other take, cut the tape, and that's what was still there when we mixed. So The process was more old school in that way, but it didn't keep them from doing things. And we were very speeding the tape constantly to get weird guitar tones and different background vocals tones and percussion recorded at different speeds, all of the studio trickery that's actually easier on tape than it is in digital because you can't get your clock to move that much on digital. And then mixing, they wanted it mixed analog and they wanted it mixed on a Neve. They just decided like, okay, so that was a thing. And it was mixed to half-inch tape. So if you buy the vinyl of that record, it's analog completely start to finish. Nothing was digitized along the way. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's more like trivia. But it was just a very conscious effort by them to do that. That's just what they wanted to do. And it's a colossal number of songs. You know, there are 28 on the record or something like that. And I think we cut 35. And then for the next record, we cut 50. So they're just a prolific band, and I absolutely love the band. So
Fantastic.
I'd been a fan since '86. So yeah.
And it's interesting, actually. You bring up this whole. I think there's this another kind of. If we're being, I'm trying to avoid talking too much about the nostalgic aspect, but in terms of tape, I think people tend to focus on the kind of sonic attributes of tape, which is a thing, as we both know. We both discussed this, but I think probably the overriding thing is that, and actually, when you and I talked about this before, I remember saying to you, I talked a lot to Flood about this, and Flood said it's all about the fact that you have to be able to play, and you actually have to be. So in other words, having your kind of, having your chops together, and if the musicianship, it doesn't mean to say you have to be accomplished. You don't, you haven't got to be technically proficient, but you need to have a vibe together as a group of musicians if it's going to work on tape. Is that your experience as well?
Yes, and it's just a different. It goes to the idea I was saying before about making decisions. Is that when you're tracking on tape, I mean, the obvious example is you're recording a guitar solo, and if you think you might be able to do a better solo, but you're out of tracks, you will erase the solo you've already got to find out. You can't undo, you can't do anything. So we would spend lots of time safetying things to be able to get back to it and whatever, but that's like a workaround. But I think in what Flood is alluding to as well is even if you're not great, you will spend forever punching in and making it great because you have to make it great right now. You can't record it and say, okay, I'll get to it later. And that not putting things off means you're constantly moving forward. You're always moving in the direction of whatever the finished product is going to be, as opposed to, well, we'll go back and edit those drums, and then maybe we'll edit the programming to match the drums, or should the drums match the programming? And meanwhile, you're singing lead vocals, but you haven't committed to the guitar sound because you recorded your guitar DI, 3 different mics and 2 room mics, but you keep changing that balance. So what is it that you have? And what tape forces you to do just as a workflow is to commit to things because you're just going to run out of tracks. And you can't slide the kick drum around when you're on tape. You can edit the tape, but you better do that before you record all the overdubs because you have to edit everything, not just the kick drum. So it's more about process and decision making. And I think that is a positive. It's hard to say that it's a negative that you should make decisions along the way, but it's very easy to do that in digital. When you're done doing takes, immediately chop them together, listen through, fix up whatever drum stuff you got to do, decide what you're going to keep from the bass and the guitars, then move on to your next overdub. Don't like, okay, I got all the takes, I'll deal with it later. So it's a mindset, and the sonic thing about tape, whatever. The fact that tape works at all is insane. And when you're making a decision between how much distortion do you want and how much do you want it to actually stick to the tape and get recorded. Yeah. There's no ideal on tape at all. No. It's just, it's distortion for free.
Do you think it's important? I mean, it's very much connected to this theme we're on here. Do you think it's important to demarcate as a producer and as a mix engineer between the technical and the aesthetic space? Do you try to not be in one whilst you're in the other? So in other words, do you try not to be editing whilst you're looking to sort of create a vibe with something? I if that makes sense. I'm being a little vague, but do you understand what I mean?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't, the idea of multitasking it's a fallacy. You're only ever doing one thing at a time. So if you're really good at switching, you can go back and forth between the technical and the creative and the technical and creative. But it's such a different mindset. So back in the day, there would be producers, engineers, assistants in the room. But now, almost always, it's just one person. So you're producing and you're engineering and you're editing and you're programming, and sometimes you're even the artist. You've got to get the technical stuff set up so that you can then ignore it and just be listening creatively. So when I'm tracking a band, like with the Gogo Bordello record, we spent the first 3/4 of the first day setting up, getting sounds, making sure everybody's headphones were great, everybody was happy, everything's quiet, setting up for songs we weren't even going to record yet, just so all the instruments were kind of ready to go, so that once we started hitting record, I could just ask the assistant to keep an eye on things and tell me if a microphone broke, because I wasn't going to notice that we were missing half the overheads. It was never going to register with me because all I'm listening to is vibe and arrangement and things like that. So you can do both, but you can only do one at a time. And every person is different as to how quickly they can switch worlds. But the important world is not the technical world. The technical world is in service to the creative world and has to be impeccable, and everything's got to be done properly, and it's got to be working, but it's not important. It's only important when it's broken or holding you back creatively.
Sure. So actually focusing on this idea of creativity and maybe making an aesthetic statement with a record, I have to ask you about the Metallica album, Death Magnetic, and the whole loudness. I know this isn't as much of an issue now with streaming services, but certainly in the 90s, there was an arms race on, wasn't there? Was that a deliberate aesthetic decision to try and make that record as kind of loud as possible?
No. I mean, I personally never made any decision based on how loud something was. It's just how it felt. And I'm not going to go into any details because there's no point, but if you know the story of that record and blah, 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 the only thing I would say about it is the artist and the producer signed off on that record because that's exactly the record they wanted to make. And that's all I'll say about that. If you listen to it now, I think it sounds super aggressive. No matter what you listen to it on, you can listen really quietly and it sounds aggressive. Normally, when something is really loud, it's only exciting when you listen loud. But I think that record is exciting when you listen quiet. So we achieved whatever it was we were trying to achieve. And there was never a thought of, hey, that's great, but let's make it louder. Like that's not a thing.
No. And I guess in connection with that, it'd be good to ask. I mean, I've talked to colleagues about this, and I've talked to students about this idea of loudness. It's something which is, in my experience, largely misunderstood. And many people have said to me, maybe you and I have even talked about this. It's very easy to make something sound loud when it's loud. It's much harder to make it sound loud when it's very, very quiet. And I wondered, this idea of using harmonic distortion as a device, and I'm not talking about in the analog world, I'm talking about in the digital world, because I use your, unashamedly, I use your omni-channel. And
me too.
We talked at user, the saturation part of that, for me, is a great way of actually being able to turn stuff down and add those harmonics, and it cuts through in a mix. I wondered if you could say anything about this idea of using distortion to create loudness or
yeah, well, I mean, if you think about it, like the simplest sound is a sine wave, right? It only has energy at one frequency. Then you start adding harmonics to that and it becomes more interesting, but it's also easier to hear. If you've got a sine wave that you're trying to hear in a mix, it's really difficult. Distort it, it's now got harmonic content, it has information at more frequencies. So that's the idea with harmonic distortion, is as opposed to just being strict harmonics that are part of the timbre of the instrument itself, because it's how it produces the sound, it becomes more sort of a thickening and a changing of that harmonic structure. And you can add a little bit of what would be considered more broadband distortion, more sort of noise distortion, things like that. And it just makes things easier to hear, period, against a backdrop of other things. And if you think about cymbals that are basically really harsh mid-rangey noise, and then you're trying to get something melodic to cut through that, the more harmonic structure that thing has, the easier it is to hear it. And then the other thing is, once you've got information at all these different frequencies, you can start to think of EQ as faders, but you're only turning up the part of the sound you want people to hear. There's no point in turning up an electric guitar that is broadband noise from 100 hertz up to 7K, because that's just going to blanket everything. But if you just turn up the 1 to 3K bit of it, notching out wherever the vocal is, now you've turned up the part of the guitar you want everybody to hear, but it's not getting in the way of everything else. And then you can add a little bit of 100 hertz if you want some thump. But things also borrow from other things. Guitars will sound like they have more low end if they're playing the same part as the bass. And that happens on a lot of rock songs where the bass and the guitars are playing the same part. You don't need low end on the guitars. I think the mistake I see with younger bands and even younger producers is this concept of like tone hunting, like, hey, we're going to do a guitar overdub. All right, this has to be the best guitar tone ever. Unless you're going to hear it by itself, it does not need to be the best guitar tone ever, and it will probably get in the way if it is. So listening to things in context and then using stuff like harmonic distortion to make them have more material so you can decide what to use is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's great. Some fantastic insights there. I kind of almost made a decision I wasn't going to go there on this in the box, out of the box argument, because I know you've answered that question 1,000 times, but I wondered if maybe if we approach it from a slightly different angle, do you think it involves a rethink? I've heard several people say to me, actually our mutual friend Chad, who has actually said this to me, sometimes I'm using 3 plug-in compressors where maybe I would have used 1 hardware compressor, but actually the goal is still the same. They're different tools, but actually, do you think it involves a sort of rethink in the way that we work in the box? I'm not saying we can't achieve the same results.
Well, I think it just goes back to what I was saying before. Analog gear, you get all this harmonic distortion and compression and filtering if there's a transformer and all this kind of stuff for free. So you're constantly shaping the sound in ways that were not intended, but are exactly the kind of thing we've been talking about. Whereas in the digital domain, unless you're using something that is just supposed to be a clone of the hardware and they're modeling all of that extra processing, you have to make the conscious decision that, oh, I need to add harmonic distortion to this thing. And that can be daunting and it can be confusing and it's a lot to think about, but that's why I put it in the preamp section of the channel strip that I put on every single track that I decide to do any processing on whatsoever. And the first knob I reach for is the saturation knob, because invariably I'm reaching for it because there's something about the sound that I'm not liking in the way it's blending in with stuff. And unless it's something really specifically wrong with the sound, like it's got very boomy low end or it's too roomy or something like that, invariably I'm trying to just make it sound more like itself, add some saturation and EQ it a little bit and you're done. So, but you have to do it manually. So it is a different thing. And I know Chad said that about, you know, the 1 compressor versus 3 compressors, but also he's been completely in the box now for longer than I have, by several years. So who knows, he might use 3 analog compressors at this point. Like it's hard to say. You can't kind of equate it because
Sure,
your taste changes. I mean, I mix completely differently now than I did 5 years ago, and both versions of that are 100% in the box. So
yeah. So I guess actually neatly you just brought up that word in terms of taste, and you know the question is there accounting for taste, and I guess that brings craft into this discussion as well. One of the questions I wanted to ask you about was in terms of style. So just going back to some of the art, I mean Justin Timberlake that I'm looking at here, Lana Del Rey, and then we've got Beyonce. Do you approach every mix in the same way, or do you have a different strategy dependent upon the genre or the style of music?
no, it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same, because the reason is because what I'm always going for in a mix is the emotional connection to it. So when I listen to the rough mix or through the tracks for the first time, I hear the way the song goes into the chorus or into the bridge, or whatever, something about it, and think like, oh God, that's got to be a moment. And this should make this happen. And oh, I want that bass to be gigantic. And so that emotional reaction to the song, that's exactly the same on every single thing I mix. It could be jazz, it could be classical, it could be hip hop, rock track. It doesn't matter. When I get to this point in the song, I want to feel like this. When I get to this point in the song, I want to feel like this. Plus, there are things, going back to the taste element, that I just like. I like drums to pound you. That's exciting to me. So that's going to be the same whether it's programmed drums or orchestral percussion or a jazz kit. Like that, it doesn't matter what it is. It's the impact of whatever the transient stuff is. I want that to be a big part of the mix. I want the vocal to always be right out in front, unless it's a very specific choice to bury the vocal. So that kind of stuff never changes. And I think it goes to the way people listen to music as well. I think when you're younger, you tend to stick to a genre. Like, I like anything that's ska and I hate everything that isn't ska or whatever. But when you start to realize the music you actually you like things in all sorts of different genres, but it turns out that if you tried to classify them emotionally, they'd probably be pretty similar. It's doubtful that you're going to like dark, dissonant classical music and sugar pop. You're going to like dark, dissonant things in any genre you can get them. And you're going to like the same sort of lyrics in terms of the emotion of the lyric. You're going to like sad stuff, or you're going to like happy stuff. And that goes across genre. And so it does for making the records as well, I think.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you say about the idea of communicating an emotion through a piece of music. And it was actually very interesting for me with my PhD, which I shared with you, where you would go and talk to producers and engineers about the way that they were making it, and it was all about, does it connect on an emotional level? It's like, who cares about the technical stuff? I just fiddle around with it until it sounds good. And actually, it's occurred to me that there's a little bit of a kind of disconnect sometimes between the message in academia and what actually really goes on out there when people are making records. Very few, and you are an exception, Andrew, and I say that as a compliment, as a huge compliment, you are able to articulate it. I come across very few other engineers and producers who are able to articulate exactly what they do. Most of them, I was talking to Steve Lillywhite, as I know that you did recently, and he just said, I don't know what I do. I just fiddle around with it a bit until it sounds good. It's all about, does it communicate on an emotional level? And I wondered if you had anything to comment there, because I see you as somebody who really can move between that kind of, I guess I'm repeating myself, but the technical and the aesthetic space.
Well, look, I mean, it goes back to the only thing that matters is what comes out of the speakers, which sounds, I've said it so many times, it sounds like a line to me, but it's a really important concept, because it's the idea of somebody hits play, they listen to the mix. That's all there is. But while you're working on a record, all you have are technical tools if you're the engineer and even the producer. I mean, obviously, you've got psychological things you do with the band to try and get them in a good headspace to get a good performance, blah, blah, blah. But basically, miking techniques, compression techniques, mixing, all of this is very, very technical, because you're using electronics and physics and digital stuff, and it's technical tools, but they are only in service of trying to solve creative problems. You're using the EQ because the chorus doesn't feel right, not because you want to do the perfect EQ to something. Like, that doesn't exist. The idea of getting somebody's settings for a piece of gear is crazy because it's source dependent. So if you put a different thing into that compressor, then obviously those compressor settings are not going to affect it in the same way. So it's very much about knowing the technology so well that when there's something that's not working, you've got a list in your head of all the things you can try to make it work. And the faster you can do that, the more technically adept you are with your tools, the more creative you will stay. Because for me, when I'm mixing, I very, very seldom have to stop and like, oh, hold on, how am I going to do this? You know, the technical side of it is so second nature to me now that all I'm doing, it feels like I'm just being creative the entire time I'm mixing, even though all I'm doing is turning knobs, which is a technical thing.
So it would be very remiss of me. I mean, you know that my area of research is creativity in artificial intelligence, and I've talked to you about this, and actually, even though I spend a lot of time working with it, I think most of it is ridiculous. For this very reason that you're actually identifying here, is that quite often creativity lies in that area. In statistics, we call them outliers. So exceptions to rules, whereas AI is totally rule based. It's like, oh, well, I'm going to train this based on a set of rules. And of course, how do you legislate for Radiohead with Creep when they put that guitar probably 10 dB louder than it should be?
Exactly.
It masks the vocal. So I wondered if I mean, I almost know this is a loaded question. I almost know what your answer is here in terms of AI. Whether we like it or not, it seems to be playing a role in our lives, not just in music.
Well, I think that there's some amazing processing stuff happening, like the Isotope RX suite of noise reduction stuff. That's all AI based. And some of it is insanely cool. The guitar de-squeak. It knows what a squeak is on an acoustic guitar. That's something I used to have to edit by hand, and it would take me hours. If it was an important exposed acoustic guitar part and it was squeaking, every single one of those had to be dealt with. Now I can put a plugin on it. So in terms of learning to listen with AI, I think some of that stuff is absolutely incredible. But the trying to figure out like what's going to be a hit, well, that's the A&R downfall for the last 70 years since A&R existed, is that something is a hit, so you try and copy it. But the problem is, first of all, you might be copying the wrong bit of it, because what you think is important about it is not what the 5 million listeners think is important about it. But also, you can only do something new once. So not every band can put a really loud chunk guitar before the chorus and have a huge hit with it. And the other thing is, that's a great song. The hook of it is a jogunk, jogunk. Like, that's amazing, and everybody waits for it. And one of the best live things I've ever seen in my life was they played a show at the Hollywood Bowl. It's got to be close to 20 years ago now. And they hadn't played Creep in forever, and they started playing Creep, and everybody went nuts, and it was all very subdued. And Johnny climbed up on an amp and jumped off the amp to do the chunk-unk, chunk-unk, and his guitar was not working. And so the lights went, pyro went, and nothing happened coming out of the PA. But it became a real moment. But you can't just do that over and over. Like when Despacito, huge hit a few years ago, and everybody decided, oh, we'll all put Quattro on our pop and hip hop tracks. Like, no, they've done that now. So that's something where you'd have to be reversing the way AI works. AI looks at a set of stuff to see what is common. And in a way, you'd have to say, well, let's take every song that came out around the time this one was popular, and what's different about this one? Because there's going to be one weird thing, but then if you copy that, it's not going to work.
Yeah. So maybe we need to teach an AI to do Spinal Tap. Maybe that is the answer.
Yeah. I think that some of the stuff being done with AI in terms of splitting the idea of the auditory scenes and being able to start to separate those, that is unbelievable. And the applications are incredible. But in terms of the creative music making part of it, I haven't seen anything that I like.
No. I'm going to shift a little because I'm conscious of time. We have one or two questions that so this is, cheers, Andrew, you're awesome. There you go. Fantastic.
Well,
that's from
cheers
Jack.
to that. Thanks very much.
There's a question here from Matt. Hi, Andrew. What can you tell us about your approach to separation in a mix? How and why do you make decisions to do with clarity versus the melding together of different sounds on a record? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think of it that way. I mean, I think when I'm putting the mix together, like, oh, that's a really important guitar part. I really want to be able to hear that. Oh, that one really blends in with this other one, so I'll pan them to the same side. It's really, I think of all of those sorts of decisions as arrangement decisions. They're not really mix decisions. Yeah, and I don't know what to say about it past that. I probably could go on for another 10 minutes, but I will get to more questions.
Well, I think so this is probably as an extension of Matt's question there. So does this bring into question the role of recording now? Most of us are mixing in the box. We have to mix in the box. So does this mean we have to take a little more time and maybe there needs to be a little more care taken over the capturing of sound? Because ultimately,
absolutely. This is exactly what we were talking about before with the decision making and all the rest of it. It's very easy to just say, look, I've got a decent microphone, I've got one preamp, and I'm just going to use it on everything. And if that's what you've got, then that's what you do. And there are plenty of amazing records that have been made that way. But you don't settle for what you get when you put that mic up. You make it work. You make it work for what it is you're trying to do. So that goes back to making decisions and having a vision from the very beginning. So recording with intent is huge, and you should do it at all times.
And at all costs.
Yeah, whatever you can do. I'm not saying you can't make a record because you don't have gear. You use the gear you've got, but you make sure you're getting something that works for you as you go.
Yeah. So it's we're drawing towards the end of this event now, and we can't end this without talking a little bit about one of the bands you've been working with recently, because we need to raise consciousness about this band. You know who I'm talking about, Motorpsycho, a Norwegian band. Tell us a little. I know these guys as well. I've worked in Trondheim for a while. Tell us a bit about Motorpsycho. How did you get involved with working with them?
Well, Motorpsycho, they're a Norwegian band. They've been around for more than 30 years. It depends how you count their records, but they've probably made 27, 28 records or something like that. I became aware of them because I was working with a different Norwegian band, and they played some for me. And this is 20 something years ago, and I was obsessed. Their album Demon Box from '94, I think it is just absolute genius. The first four songs couldn't be any more different than they are from each other, but are amazing. Love the band. Actually went to a music festival in Norway in 2015 because they were going to play Demon Box live for the first time forever. Like, they don't play any of those songs. Their catalog is so deep that the songs just don't come up. And through some friends, including a different Norwegian band that I knew, managed to meet them and then got to work with them. So I've worked with them now, I think, on five albums. We've got plans to do a sixth. And it's like with the Chili Peppers. It's just a dream come true. An amazing band. They've gone on a journey from coming out as sort of the black metal Norwegian scene through folk, pop, everything. And at the moment, they're just a super heavy prog power trio. One of the songs on the last album we put out is 40 minutes long. Yeah. So that tells you all you need to know.
That's definitely an aesthetic expression or a statement.
Yes.
So yeah, absolutely. Great. Andrew, this has been absolutely wonderful, and I mean, and we're really grateful at London College of Music and University of West London for this. I'm just going to look and see if there are any last minute questions in here, but we've got maybe one. Do we have time for maybe just one more question?
They'll come kick us out.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks for this brilliant event. I noticed you were a sound designer for Quincy Jones.
Yeah,
Quincy Jones worked with Michael Jackson in terms of sound design for an album. Yeah, so I guess he's asking about your approach to sound design and how you were used in that project.
Well, that was really specific. I mean, I got a call. I'd done the Michael Jackson record, the History record, so I knew Bruce would be in, and Bruce was working on this Quincy record, and he just called me up and said, "Andrew, get in your car." And this was like 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. I'm like, okay. And I came down to the studio, and I don't even remember which song it was, but there was this big kind of sound effects collage thing to open the song. And I just spent 2 days putting it through Q Sound and making it work because I'm a geek and I learned it, and that was it. So that was just a really specific thing.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting. There's so many questions in here about the synclavier. What is the obsession? Have you ever used the Arturia one? They do a plug-in version.
Yeah, I've checked it out, but it was mainly just the FM synthesis, which is the part I used the least. I mean, I sampled and used the disc recorder and stuff.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so I mean, I guess it's so great. I mean, just from you and I talking, we talked a lot about a lot of things, haven't we? We talked about hearing, we talked about music perception, we talked about so many different things, and I don't know if there's a kind of summing up comment from you in terms of how your vision for the way that we're making music. I mean, we're in the middle of a lockdown. I mean, we're in unprecedented circumstances. Has this changed anything for you? I mean, the circumstances, I guess maybe it hasn't from what you said at the beginning, but has this forced you to rethink anything?
Well, I mean, I've been really lucky because I've been working at home for 25 years. So my work hasn't changed, but obviously the work I'm getting has changed because the records I love to do the most are records made by bands and bands in a room recording. And so that's almost impossible to do now. So, but that will change. I mean, look, the pandemic is horrific, and I would bet we've got another year of this before we're actually back to where we don't have to really think about it all the time. But then we don't have to think about it all the time. And it's been 100 years since we had to think about a pandemic all the time. So it's horrible. And I'm in a very lucky position in terms of how I'm getting through it. But there will be a time when that's not the case, and there will be bands in studios again. And what will change, though, is, as with any crisis in any industry, is supply will meet demand. Studios are closing all over the place, but probably some new studios will be able to open, or studios will retool to be more useful and better value or something like that. So we will get back to making those kinds of records. And I think that we're just, I mean, how lucky are we that you can make records on a laptop? You know, Billie Eilish won how many Grammys? Record on a laptop in a bedroom pre-lockdown. And that's exactly how you can make records now. So there's no excuse for anything unless you're a band that likes to be in very large rooms while you record. Well, okay, take a rain check on that for a second, but there's no reason to stop being creative or to stop working on music.
Maybe we need to take a leaf out of the John Martin book and go and record an album across a lake or something. Then we can socially distance at the same time.
Yeah. I think considering it's all freezing fog near me, I'm going to stay home.
I think you should. Listen, Andrew, this has been amazing, and I hope this has been, I hope this has been really informative and useful for everyone else. And on behalf of, as I said, once again, London College of Music, University of West London, we'd really like to thank you for your great insights and this chat we've had.
Well, thanks for having me. Absolutely, thank you.
So I don't know if Liz wants to come back in now, or how this.
I don't know how this works. Well,
I don't know how this bit works actually. Sorry.
Well, I suppose we could just. Oh, here she comes.
Hi, Liz.
Hey, I'm back. The power. People bringing me in and out of the videos. Gosh, I mean, the pair of you, thank you so much. I think both of you are really inspiring for the students, and the information and motivation that you can pass on to them. And I loved the positivity about Andrew. I'm kind of in the same thinking as you, as life carries on, and we're really fortunate in so many ways, professionally and personally, so many of us. And I think it's something that I've been talking to my students about quite a lot lately, is finding new ways of creating and making music, and rather than keeping hankering on to things perhaps just as they were, is actually thinking about how we can be motivated and pushed forward to creating new opportunities. And that, how lucky the students are. And they sort of look at me when I say, oh, you're lucky living in this time, but like putting themselves in the middle of a new creative arts industry, which is being formed and forged and molded as we speak, literally as we speak. And it's really motivating to hear from practitioners like both of you, and insights that you can pass on to our students. I'm just having a look with regards to if there are any questions that have come through on the chat, but they don't seem to have appeared on my chat. So
lots of thank yous, and we appreciate you. So
well, it's lovely to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Gary,
much.
if you've got access, Gary, to the questions, if you could, because I'm unable to see them at the moment. So
yeah, I was just conscious of time, Liz, because I thought you had another session starting at 3.
But I've just had the message saying very happy for Andrew to answer a couple of questions.
Well, let's run over.
Okay.
I can talk.
Actually, there's a question here. So, anonymous attendee. So, working with Rick Rubin, how does his whole philosophy differ from other producers? Is the philosophical approach important?
Well, I think that the idea, a successful producer is always pursuing the vision of the record, and whether that's their vision or the artist's vision, that can vary from producer to producer. It's more, I think the difference is only kind of how hands-on they are. Like there's some producers who are incredibly involved with every tiny little detail and performance, and there are other producers who are always thinking big picture but are more than happy to leave you to work on things and then come back in and assess them. So I mean, those are the differences, but I don't know of any successful producer who doesn't have the philosophical approach of we're trying to make this great.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's more nuts and bolts that are different.
Thank you. There's another question here about mastering, actually.
All right.
Wondering what your views are on mastering with modern technology like you mentioned isotope, as opposed to mastering yourself. So I guess it's almost it's a little bit of a kind of an intelligence, kind of an artificial intelligence question, I guess.
Well, I mean, look, this goes back again to what matters is what comes out of the speakers. So if you use the isotope stuff, for instance, that listens to your track and suggests things, and then you hear that and go, God, that's great, then you should absolutely do that. But if you do that and you think, I'm not really sure if that's better, you can't trust that it's better because the plugin said, oh, it should be this way. Because again, it's been trained on a certain group of things, and those things may not have been weighted with your aesthetic. I like a ton of low end. So that's not necessarily something that they would decide is a good thing. So I think as long as you just listen, it doesn't matter what tools you use. In terms of having like you need to master with this or that or the other thing, I have absolutely no thoughts about that whatsoever. I just want it to come back from mastering better. And if it isn't better, then we go back to what I had, and that's it.
Yeah, it's a little bit anecdotal, but so I used to do a lot of work with George Michael, and he would never allow a mastering engineer to touch his records, never. And he in his experience was that they never make it sound better; they always make it sound worse. So I don't know what's
yeah, I mean, look, they're going to make it sound different, and the better or worse is completely subjective. There's no way you can say this sounds better than that. I mean, I'm sure in some instances you can, but for the most part, it's just what you like and what you respond to.
Yeah. One last question, Andrew, and it's from one of my students, David Hyde, which I've only just spotted, and he'll lynch me if I don't ask you this question. So apologies, David, if you're listening. Well, I hope you're listening anyway, because here's the answer, hopefully. So Andrew, thank you so much for talking to us today. I love your rear bus technique, but you've mentioned that it can end up squashing the mix. How much does this become an issue for you? And if it doesn't, is it just a price worth paying for the excitement? So sorry, we finished with a question on compression, Andrew.
No, well, it's fine. I mean, look, everything is a trade-off. There's almost nothing you're going to do while you're working on a mix where you say, wow, that's better. It's like, oh, that's better, but it's changed this other thing. There's always a trade-off. And the rear bus, which if people don't know, is basically, it's like a second mix bus. So my mix bus I don't have a compressor on the mix at all. I have a limiter at the very end, but there's no compressor. But I send everything in the mix except for the drums into a stereo compressor, compress it more than it would normally be if that were going to be a mix, and then I blend it in. Just very sort of textbook parallel compression technique. Yeah. So instead of bringing the peaks down to meet the RMS level stuff, I'm bringing the RMS up. But what it does is it brings up the noise, it brings up the thing, and that can be very exciting. It makes lots of stuff interact in a way that it won't interact unless you run it into dynamics processing. But at the same time, it leaves the uncompressed version of the vocals, the kick and snare transients and all of that in the mix, which is something that I like. I don't like the sound of a compressor on a mix anymore. I never use one anymore. But it makes the mix more dense. It makes it harder to hear individual things. There's less space around stuff because you're bringing up all this low-level stuff. So lately, I've been using a lot less of it. And in terms of numbers, I mean, it's on a VCA, so I'd say I'm using probably 12 dB less of it than I used a year ago, because I'm just now in that balancing act in my head starting to dislike the bad parts more than liking the good parts. So I use less and less and less, and I have to do things in other ways. So it's just changing aesthetic.
That's a great answer, actually, Andrew. And it's interesting because a question just came in at that point. I'll answer this one for you, Andrew. Do you put lots of plugins on a mix bus? No.
I've got, I think 3 or 4 that are basically just EQ, and I don't even use them all the time.
Mm.
And then I've got a little stereo widening, and then I've got a limiter.
Mm.
And that's
there
it.
You go.
Yeah.
There you go. Oh, somebody asked about the D-Squeak tool.
It's an
AI.
isotope guitar D-Squeak, and there's like a mouth D or a D mouth noise thing, which gets rid of all of those noises.
Yeah.
It's like magic.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Actually, I can recommend, and I don't work for them. I have no interest in the company, but Oaken Sound Soothe is a really, I found it's great for squeaky guitars as well. So,
yep, Soothe is awesome. And that's another kind of AI-ish thing.
Yeah, it's great.
And on that note, I'm going to interrupt. I've just had the go-ahead that we are going to move on. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time and your kindness and your expertise and all the insights that you've given to the students today. The session's been really enjoyable. Gary, see you around.
Pleasure.
Hopefully very soon. Thank you so much. Andrew, so nice to meet you.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you very much for being here today. Hugely appreciated.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care, Andrew.
Okay, bye.